Imagine you buy a house, a fixer-upper, one with potential. And you're excited to get started, picturing the transformation. But as you're clearing out the basement, you find something horrifying. Like truly horrifying.
Yeah.
A mummified body hidden under a water heater.
Wow.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a case from Sac City, Iowa, back in 2012. And it starts with that exact scenario.
That's a heck of a discovery. It's one of those things, it reminds you that even in ordinary places, there can be darkness lurking. And in this case, that darkness, it went unnoticed for years. Hidden under clutter, forgotten memory.
Yeah, it really sets the stage for a creepy story, right?
Yeah.
So a man named Mark Coer vanishes, is declared legally dead, and then years later, his body's found in this totally unexpected way.
And the fact that the body was mummified, well, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the case,
Yeah.
We're not just dealing with a murder here, but also a deliberate attempt to hide the crime, to erase a life.
So before we get into the investigation, let's try to understand who Mark Coer was. He seems like a bit of an enigma, even to those who knew him.
Yeah, he was. From what we know, Mark lived a pretty solitary life. He was one of 11 children, but he chose to stay away from most of his family. He opted for that, quiet small-town life.
Yeah.
His passions were simple: online poker, went fishing sometimes. But there's this sense of isolation around him, like he chose to exist on the edge of things,
Yeah, and that isolation makes his disappearance even more strange, right? I mean, if he wasn't close to a lot of people, who would even notice he was gone?
That's a really good point. When someone lives a life detached from others, it's easier for them to slip through the cracks. Their absence might not raise any immediate alarms, which gives a potential killer, a head start.
And it seems like that's exactly what happened here. Mark disappears in 2009, and it's not until 2012 that his body is found. Totally by accident. But what's even weirder is that his family had him declared legally dead in 2011, a whole year before they found his body.
That's really unusual. Declaring someone legally dead, well, it requires a lot of evidence they're no longer alive. Usually this means a long absence, no contact, or proof of a fatal accident, something like that. It's a complicated legal process. And it has big implications, for their estate, legal matters, that kind of thing.
So what does that tell us about the initial investigation? Were the police not thorough enough? Or were there just no signs of foul play back then?
Well, the reports say that the initial investigation didn't find any signs of a struggle or forced entry. All of Mark's stuff was undisturbed. His car was in the garage. It looked like he left voluntarily.
But we know that's not true. So was there anything that hinted at something more sinister, something that maybe should have been looked into further?
There's one thing that stands out, one thing that maybe should have raised more suspicion at the time.
Okay.
A note found on the back door of Mark's house.
This is that note that says, "Gone to Florida with Tom for the winter."
Right. Seems harmless, but I guess it becomes a big clue. Exactly. At first glance, it reinforces that idea that Mark left on his own. But as investigators dug deeper, this note and who Tom was became super important to figuring out the truth behind Mark's disappearance.
So let's talk about Tom then. Who was he, and how did he fit into Mark's life?
Well, at first, the investigators had no clue who this Tom was. They traced the phone number on that note to a resort down in Florida. But there was no record of Mark or Tom ever being there. It's like Tom was a ghost.
Wow.
Like he never even existed.
But then a neighbor comes forward, and they have some interesting information. It turns out this Tom, he wasn't just a name on a note. He was a real person, and he had lived with Mark.
And the neighbor, they had a specific detail about Tom, a detail that would be super important to the investigation. Apparently, this Tom, he had a habit of carrying his Pomeranian. Like a clutch purse.
Like a clutch purse. Okay, you don't see that every day.
Yeah, it's a little unusual. And, in criminal investigations, sometimes those little quirks, those weird details, they can be the most telling. This made Tom instantly recognizable.
All right.
Sets him apart from all the other people Mark might have known.
So, this very specific detail leads them to their first suspect, Tom Foley. He fits the description, had lived with Mark, and even owned a Pomeranian. Case closed, right?
No, not so fast.
Yeah.
While Foley looked promising, his alibi checked out. He was in Kansas City when Mark disappeared. Witnesses and everything.
Oh, wow.
Back to square one.
So what then?
Well, Foley, he throws another name into the mix. He tells the investigators to look into a guy named John Green, someone who had lived with him and Mark back in Texas. And with this new name, the investigation takes a serious turn.
Yeah.
It leads down a path with twists and dead ends and the evolving role of technology in solving crimes.
Oh, this is sitting good.
So last time we were talking about John Green, this mysterious figure from Mark Coer's past.
Right, right. And Tom Foley, he suggested that investigators look into John Green. But how do they even connect him to Sac City? And even more importantly, how did they connect him to Mark's disappearance? This is where the investigation really starts to, like, pick up speed, right?
This is where digital forensics becomes crucial.
Okay.
And you have to remember, this was 2012. Cell phones, everyone had them, and the data on those phones, well, that was becoming super valuable for law enforcement.
So the investigators start digging into phone records. I imagine getting those back then wasn't as simple as it is now, right?
Not at all. Ben Smith, he was the Sac County attorney at the time, and he really had to push for this. He had to convince the phone company to go back into their archives, something they weren't exactly thrilled about doing. This wasn't just, pushing a button. It meant someone had to manually pull those records. Super tedious and time-consuming.
It really shows you how dedicated Ben Smith was to this case. He wasn't going to let bureaucracy get in the way of, getting justice for Mark Coer.
And his persistence paid off. After hours of going through those records, they find this little detail. Just one call made from John Green's phone to a police department in Mississippi. And this call was made during the exact time Green was supposed to be in Sac City.
Wait, hold on. So we've got a homicide in Iowa, a suspect who might be in Florida, and now a random call to Mississippi. This is starting to feel like a cross-country road trip.
It gets even more complicated.
Yeah.
Remember how Mark's family had him declared legally dead?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that right around the same time, John Green was reported missing in Mississippi.
Okay, this is where I get a little lost. Does this mean Green is more likely to be involved or less likely? It feels like every new piece of information just makes things more confusing.
It's definitely a head-scratcher. On the one hand, maybe Green was also a victim of some, foul play, something totally separate from Mark's disappearance.
Yeah.
But then again, maybe it's a deliberate attempt to, create confusion, a red herring to throw off the investigators.
So what did the investigators do with this new information? Did they move their focus to Mississippi?
They had to tread carefully. They couldn't just assume that Green's disappearance in Mississippi was connected to Mark's murder. They needed something concrete that linked him to Sac City.
So back to those phone records.
Exactly. And this time, they weren't just looking for calls. They were looking for location data. That was pretty new tech back then, but some cell phones had GPS capabilities, so they could track movements.
Did they manage to get Green's location data? I'm guessing they needed a warrant for that. A lot of red tape to cut through.
They did.
Yeah.
And what they found was both interesting and frustrating. Green's phone did ping off towers in Sac City during the time Mark disappeared. But the data was spotty, incomplete. It placed him in the area, but not specifically at Mark's house.
So enough to put him in the general vicinity, but not enough to directly tie him to the crime. What did they do then?
They had to think bigger. They knew Green was transient, always on the move, so they started tracking his phone across state lines. This digital trail led them from Florida all the way to Georgia.
And was he in Georgia? Did they finally catch up to him?
They did. They found him living in a camper on some rural property, the middle of nowhere. But they had to be smart about how they approached him. They couldn't just barge in and risk scaring him off.
So how did they approach him? Did they go undercover or cook up some elaborate plan to get him talking?
The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, working with Sac County, they came up with this clever tactic. They decided to approach Green pretending to investigate something completely different, something that had nothing to do with Mark Coer.
Oh, that's smart. A way to get close to him without tipping him off. What was this fake investigation about?
They kept it vague. Something about a possibly stolen vehicle, just enough to get him talking without making him feel like he was the target. And to make sure they could document the encounter, they used button cameras, which were relatively new back then.
I can only imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been for the investigators seeing John Green face-to-face for the first time. Did he look like the description Tom Foley gave them?
He did. And there was another detail that confirmed they had the right guy. He was carrying his Pomeranian. Just like that neighbor said.
Okay, so they finally found their guy. But getting him back to Iowa for questioning, that had to be another whole ordeal, right?
Oh, absolutely. Extradition across state lines, it's complicated. It takes cooperation from multiple jurisdictions. They couldn't just grab him and go. They had to follow the rules, make sure his rights were respected.
And this whole time, his phone is basically leading them right to him.
It was. They got a warrant to turn on his phone's GPS locator so they could track his movements in real time. Every 15 minutes, they got an update on his location.
So even if he was moving, trying to stay one step ahead, they were always right there behind him.
Exactly, like a digital game of cat and mouse. And eventually, that trail led them to a casino parking lot in Jacksonville, Florida. That's where they finally caught John Green.
I bet there was a huge sense of relief when they finally had him in custody. But I imagine the investigation was far from over at that point. They still needed to get a confession out of him and build a case strong enough to hold up in court.
Absolutely. And how they managed to secure that confession, well, it's a fascinating look at interrogation tactics and how to use psychology to persuade someone.
So they finally caught John Green. After this, crazy cross-country chase using his own phone to track him down. It's like something out of a movie, right? But now the real work begins, right? They have to get him to confess.
Yeah, you'd think the arrest would be the big climax. But it's really just the start of a whole new chapter. And this chapter focuses on a very specific place, the interview room.
Right, because they have Green in custody, but they need him to actually admit to what happened. What was their strategy going into this interview?
This is where things get really interesting. They didn't use a typical interrogation room, one of those stark, intimidating rooms. They used a room that's usually for interviewing child victims. Bright colors, friendly, even toys scattered around.
That seems a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? Wouldn't you want the suspect to feel the pressure, the seriousness of the situation?
It's all about psychology. They wanted Green to feel comfortable, relaxed. Even his Pomeranian, they let it be in the room with him. The whole point is to build rapport, to encourage him to talk, to open up.
And did it work? Did Green just come right out and confess to killing Mark?
Not right away. At first, he denied ever even being in Iowa. He stuck to his story. But the investigators, they had a secret weapon, those phone records. They spent so long analyzing them, remember?
So they let him talk, let him build up his story, knowing they had the proof to contradict him.
Exactly. It's classic. You let the suspect think they're in control, then you slowly dismantle their story with hard facts. About 27 minutes into the interview, they hit him with those phone records. They showed him, look, you were in Sac City.
I can imagine that moment, the realization hitting Green that his alibi, the story he'd built up, it was falling apart. What was his reaction?
He tried to backpedal, came up with some other explanations, but the investigators, they kept the pressure on, gently but firmly, guiding him towards the truth. And then comes the turning point. They tell him Mark Coer is dead.
And how did he react to that?
This is the chilling part. Green showed no surprise, no remorse, no sadness. It was like he already knew, like it didn't even matter to him. That lack of emotion, well, it spoke volumes to the investigators.
Yeah, it definitely suggests he was not only there, but maybe even involved in Mark's death. But did he confess at that point?
The investigators, they used that moment brilliantly. Instead of straight up accusing Green, they offered him a way out. Tell us your side of the story, they said. They played to his ego, suggesting there was a good reason for what he did.
And Green, he took the bait.
He did. Green finally admitted he'd been in Iowa, that he stayed with Mark for a month, and that things escalated, they got into a fight, and that led to Mark's death.
So what was his version of events? What was it that led to this deadly fight?
Well, Green claimed self-defense. He said that Mark attacked him with a baseball bat, and he choked him to protect himself in the heat of the moment.
It sounds possible, I guess, a fight, a struggle, a tragic ending. But something about that self-defense claim just doesn't feel right, does it?
You're right to question it. If you look at the forensics, especially the nature of Mark's injuries, well, it casts doubt on Green's story. Strangulation, it's rarely an act of self-defense. It's not something that just happens in a moment of panic. It takes sustained pressure, a deliberate act of violence.
Right. And then there's the kitty litter. Green admitted he used it to cover up the smell of Mark's decomposing body. That doesn't seem like the actions of someone who just accidentally killed someone, right?
No, it doesn't. His actions after the killing, they point to premeditation, a carefully planned cover-up. It really undermines that self-defense claim. It suggests something much more sinister was going on.
Okay, so they have a confession, but what about the motive? Why kill Mark? What sparked this whole thing? What caused the fight?
Get this. This is where it gets almost absurd. Green said the argument. It started over undercooked chicken.
Undercooked chicken. Seriously, that's the reason he killed someone. And then went through all that trouble to hide it.
It sounds ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Almost too trivial to be believable. But in a way, it shows how fragile life is, how quickly things can escalate, how a little disagreement can spiral out of control and lead to horrible consequences.
So what happened next? Was Green arrested right then and there, charged with murder?
He was arrested and then extradited to Iowa to stand trial. But the legal process, it wasn't simple. His first trial actually ended in a mistrial because of a mistake the prosecution made.
A mistrial? What happened?
During his testimony, one of the police officers, he used the term bad guys when he was describing how they respond to suspects. And the defense, they objected immediately. They argued that this biased the jury against Green before he even had a chance to defend himself.
And the judge agreed with them.
The judge ruled that the officer's words were prejudicial and declared a mistrial. It just shows you how even a little slip-up, one seemingly harmless phrase, can have huge consequences in court.
So, back to the beginning.
Not quite. Before the mistrial, Green, he was offered a plea deal, 10 years for manslaughter. His family, although they were conflicted, they agreed to it. The prosecution felt like it was fair considering the circumstances and because Green's demeanor, at first it seemed like he was remorseful,
10 years for taking a life. That seems incredibly lenient. Did Green accept the deal?
He didn't. He decided to risk it, gamble on a second trial, thinking he could convince a jury he was innocent. But that decision, well, it backfired.
What happened during the second trial? Did anything change?
Things changed a lot. Green, his whole demeanor was different. He came across as cold, calculating, almost arrogant at times. The jury saw a totally different side of him, a side that wasn't sympathetic at all.
So the prosecution, did they have any new evidence?
They really focused on the forensics, emphasizing how the evidence didn't support Green's self-defense story. And they brought up Green's gambling addiction, suggesting that he was desperate for money and saw Mark as an easy target.
And what about the defense? What was their approach?
They tried to make it look like Mark Coer was the one who started it. They even introduced his mental health records, showing that he had a history of anger problems, trying to suggest that maybe he was the one who started the fight.
That feels risky, doesn't it? Like they were trying to deflect the blame onto the victim, to diminish Mark's life by bringing up his personal struggles.
It's a strategy you see a lot in cases where the victim, well, where they're not seen as very sympathetic. But in this case, it didn't work.
So what was the verdict?
The jury found John Green guilty. Second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It seemed like justice had finally been served. But then, Ben Smith, the prosecutor, the one who fought so hard to put Green behind bars, he did something completely unexpected.
This is where it takes that last surprising turn, right? What did Ben Smith do?
He asked for Green's sentence to be reduced. He felt like 50 years was just too much. It didn't fit the complexities of the case.
Wow, that's unusual. What were his reasons for wanting a shorter sentence?
Smith argued that even though Green did something terrible, there were other things to consider. He felt that Green's gambling problem, it played a big role in his decisions, that it led him down this path of desperation and ultimately to violence.
So did the judge agree to reduce the sentence?
After some back and forth, they reached a compromise. A new sentence was given. Green would be eligible for parole after serving 15 years. It was a middle ground. They acknowledged how serious the crime was, but they also recognized that maybe, just maybe, Green could change, could rehabilitate himself.
It's a decision that really makes you think. On the one hand, John Green, he took a life, and he went to a lot of trouble to hide what he did. But on the other hand, you get the sense that it was a combination of things that led him to that point. Desperation, bad choices, all coming together.
And that's what's so fascinating about these kinds of deep dives. They make us look beyond the surface. They force us to think about the nuances of why people do what they do, the ripple effects of our choices, and what justice really means.
This case shows how easily ordinary lives can become intertwined, and how that can lead to tragedy. It reminds us that darkness can hide in plain sight, and that even the smallest choices, the seemingly insignificant ones, can have profound impacts on our lives and the lives of those around us.
And as we wrap up our deep dives today, we're left with a question that lingers. Did Mark Coer, this quiet man who kept to himself, did he receive the justice he deserved? What does justice even mean in a situation like this? There are no simple answers. But by asking these questions, by wrestling with them, we learn, we evolve, and hopefully we create a world where justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone.